Army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, boppers. This is Bill Bupert, and welcome to Chasing Ghosts in Irregular Warfare podcast. This is episode 84, Blood in the Water. The U.S. Navy is sunk. Now, you might ask yourself, for those who are perennial and persistent listeners to this podcast, both Chasing Ghost and War Notes, which I publish on occasion to cover conventional conflict, why I would characterize this particular Jeremiah that I'm going to levy against the U.S. Navy. Why would I do so in Chasing Ghosts instead of War Notes? Well, the reason is it's because Chasing Ghosts has always been about the other warfare, asymmetric warfare, irregular warfare, and those are the very notions, for the most part, that are causing the conventional forces of the U.S. Navy, if they were wise, to take a knee, take a pause, recalibrate their martial imagination, maybe go back to Mahan's notions on sea power back in the 19th century, updated during the wars that have been fought magnificently by the U.S. Navy, for instance, in the Pacific Theater of Operations, under one of the finest naval officers this country, if not any country, has ever produced, and that would be Admiral Chester Nimitz, a close second being my favorite admiral of all, Admiral Raymond Spruance in World War II. A slight interregnum, the usual housekeeping. If you wish to get in touch with me, you can email me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me, which you will find in the show notes on the podcast vendor of your choice through which you are listening to this as we speak. And if you get the opportunity to put a 4 or 5 star review on there, that'll be great. If you put a narrative review on, I will be forever in your debt. And of course, I have a Substack. One of the reasons why I formed that Substack was so that I could have a comments function under the episode and the show notes so that we could have a conversation, discussion, or maybe you could even call me out for either a lack of evidence or getting something incorrect. And if it turns out that you are correct, I will be the one to yield to your superior evidence. Speaking of which, getting back to the podcast episode itself, in 1981, one Taiichi Ono walked into a Toyota factory and did something no one expected. He promoted the worst performing teams instead of the best ones. Everyone assumed he'd made a mistake, but Ono wasn't looking at results on paper. He was watching what was happening on the factory floor. The top performing teams were hitting targets by cutting corners, skipping important checks, and quietly passing defects to the next stage of production. Their numbers looked great, but hidden problems were building up beneath the surface. The slower teams were different. When they found a problem, they stopped the production line immediately. They pulled the famous Toyota Andon cord and exposed issues in real time, even if it hurt their short-term performance. Most managers would have punished them for slowing things down. Taiichi Ono rewarded them instead. Why? Because he understood that most organizations still struggle to learn. If you reward results alone out of context, people learn to hide problems. If you reward the process, people expose problems and improve the system. The outcome, of course, was remarkable. Fewer defects, less waste and rework, higher product quality, stronger long-term performance. And also, it formed a habitude, a kind of commitment to work in which one would hesitate if you found things wrong, reevaluate, and from the tactical, operational, and strategic level, in a military context, This would be the kind of thing that one could derive from really listening to the after-action reviews of those forces that came before you. And as anyone who knows who has listened to this podcast for a while, you realize that I highly value critical thinking, and I also highly value the fact that if I find myself or others in error, I will be the one to point it out or have it pointed out to me so that I could even recalibrate or take a look at things that I may have done in error. Taiichi Ono is also the author, I wouldn't say inventor, I'd say maybe discoverer, of Ono's 5 Whys, which is a very simple form of Socratic drilling in which what you do is, again and again, you ask yourself, if you're trying to assess what a proximate or root cause is to a failure tree that's before you, you would do Ono's 5 Whys, which is, well, why did that happen? Well, why did the fire take place in the janitor's closet? Oh, the janitor was smoking. Was he supposed to be smoking? Were all the tools there? And then you continue in the why and continue the drilling until you find the proximate causes and the root causes. And I say root causes because, as I've discovered, there isn't always a singular cause, and there tends to be a cavalcade of calamities, if not a cascade of failure, that informs these kind of events, small and large. Again, for those of you who have been listening to me for a while, will be no stranger to the animus I have against the aircraft carrier as a naval asset and an exquisite platform. And I'm convinced it is the crossbow and chariot of the 21st century. Now, this doesn't mean that during World War II in the Pacific Theater of Operations, from 1942 until 1945, with the victory, the absolute manifest and existential victory over the Japanese in the summer of 1945, the carriers were the weapon of choice. Well, it just so happens that after August, September 1945, we maintained the carriers. We were nostalgic for what carriers had done in that brief flash in the pan time from 1942 to 1945 and thought that that very thing would carry the U.S. Navy not only throughout the 20th century, but with technological advancement and maybe even tactics, techniques, and procedures improvements would prove to be the single most important asset of the U.S. Navy. I happen to think that that legacy probably peaked in the 1950s, in that with the age of missiles and then rushing forth into the 21st century, with this age of very inexpensive and very voluminous FPVs, UASs, things like that, the days of the carrier are not numbered, they are over. Drawing on much for those of you who have listened to me over the years around the fire pit, you realize that not only is the carrier as an exquisite platform extinct, but they haven't realized it yet, but that as in 2002 Millennium Challenge, USMC General Paul Van Riper proved, when one uses asymmetric devices as cheap as miles or kilometers of communications wire at the beach when you attack port facilities, whether that is the embarkation on the ships for travel over the Atlantic or the Pacific, or the debarkation at the receiving port, that all of these are soft targets. All of these are surfaces of opportunity for the very savvy peer enemy combatant to take advantage of. I've told you that I've entirely dismissed the notion of third world and fourth world and developing world and near peer, because right now, right here in 21st century conflict, the UAS, the FPV, the UAV, the flying unmanned modality has made every country on earth who is able to use those a peer to the U.S. in eliminating American military power. Now, in previous episodes, I've made mention of one Commander Jeff Vandenegel, who talked about the carrier and had his own offerings and suggestions for what one would do to reconceive and reimagine the U.S. naval surface warfare fleet in the 21st century. If you go back to Chasing Ghost episode number 34 and War Notes number 10, and Dispatch number 6, this is all in the show notes, which is an essay that I penned concerning all the data dumps I could find to make my case for why the carrier as an exquisite platform should go the way of the dodo. So in March 2026, for those of you who don't read proceedings, I urge you to take a look at it on occasion. I used to read it religiously, but unfortunately, in the last 15 years, the U.S. Navy has not only taken a turn for the worse and not commissioned a successful hull since the Arleigh Burke hit the saltwater in 1991. That's been followed by absolute shipbuilding disasters, from the Zumwalt to the Little Crappy Ship to the USS Ford, the carrier that can neither launch nor retrieve aircraft reliably. So, National Policy and the Pan-Oceanic Navy by Commander Jeff Vandenegel. You will note that Jeff is still a commander. He should be an admiral, but that's the way things work. When you have somebody with this kind of intellectual heft and martial reimagining of the way things should be in this century of conflict, those are not going to be the guys who make flag rank in today's service. I have my own Navy pedigree, but I was simply a lowly and middling intelligence petty officer in the U.S. Navy in the 1980s. I felt fortunate to have been in the Navy at the time. One of the reasons why I got my commission in the U.S. Army 4 years after I got out, after attending college, in order to earn that and not become a limited duty officer in the U.S. Navy, was twofold. Number one, to avoid the surface warfare officer trap and going haze, gray, and underway. Hence, I got my commission in the U.S. Army to avoid sea duty. If you happen to hear a cat in the background, that will be because my door is closed, and Tiberius, my cat, is outside of the door of my podcast studio begging to come in, but every time he comes in, he crawls over me and the keyboard and the microphone and stuff like that. So if you hear that precious meow from Tiberius, that's why that's happening. One of the best analyses of this I found was by one centrist libertarian patriot. That's the nom de plume on Substack. The document exists. Nobody assigned them as mandatory reading is the title of the post, and I will put that in the show notes to give him his due on this great analysis. He says in here, it is historically grounded, analytically honest, and institutionally courageous. A serving officer making the case in print that the Navy's most expensive and politically entrenched platform is increasingly indefensible in the primary theater against the primary adversary. That takes something. Read it carefully and something else becomes visible. Because what happens here is that Samuel Huntington, in Proceedings in 1954, published an article called National Policy in the Transoceanic Navy as his intellectual framework. And he had a three-part architecture of strategic concept, public support, organizational structure. Then he applied that to the current threat environments at the time. And this was the 1950s, of course, and it was the beginning of the Cold War. And James Hornfisher's last book covers this adroitly. That book is Who Can Hold the Sea, the U.S. Navy in the Cold War, 1945 to 1960. Unfortunately, James Hornfisher, one of the finest naval historians of our age, died prematurely as a result of cancer. Now, what you will note if we fast forward here from Huntington in the 1950s is there is something called the 1986 Maritime Strategy, essentially a late Cold War update to Huntington's Transoceanic Navy article. That is not correct, because Vandenegel does not cite from a naval officer. He does not mention advancing an analytical move. He is now in 2026 reconstructing from first principles. In 1974, Admiral Stansfield Turner published Missions of the U.S. Navy in the Naval War College Review. The Navy was at its post-Vietnam nadir, budget-gutted, strategically confused, operationally confused, institutional identity fractured by Zumwalt's Project 60 reforms, and a resurgent Soviet submarine threat, a nuclear submarine threat, that the existing doctrine had no coherent answer for. Turner didn't reach for grand strategic Mahanian framing. He asked a harder, narrower, more useful question. What specific missions must the Navy be able to execute, and what does credible execution of each mission actually require? Well, his answer, and this is according to that post that you will find in the show notes, so I can give credit to the author. That would not be Van den Nagel, but the gentleman who wrote this Substack essay. His answer was a 4-mission taxonomy: strategic deterrence, sea control, power projection, naval presence, each with defined content, credibility conditions, and resource implications. It was an institutional intervention disguised as a framework. It told the Navy not what it was for in the abstract, but what it had to be able to do in the specific against the actual threat, with the actual forces it could realistically build and sustain. That is the document that became the intellectual foundation of the 1986 maritime strategy. Secretary John Lehman, famous for his Reagan-esque 600-ship Navy ambitions, was the one who would champion this. The Naval War College wargaming community stress-tested the operational concept. I hope they steel-manned it too. The forward offensive strategy into Soviet home waters, the Norwegian sea flanking pressure, that would be where that Icelandic and Northern European choke point is, the SSB and Bastion attack that complicated the Soviet war termination calculations in ways arms control theorists found alarming, and Lehman found useful. And then he evinces something interesting. The absence of Turner from the 70s into the maritime strategy from the 1980s, that Van den Nagel's intellectual architecture is not noting, it's perhaps evidence of something more consequential. The institutional transmission mechanism failed. The knowledge existed. It wasn't transferred to the people who needed it at the moment they needed it most. Naval professional military education curricula do not lose things randomly. They lose things because someone decided something else was more important, and because the intellectual tradition those documents represented had no active institutional constituency defending their inclusion, or because a generation of officers whose careers were built in the Arabian Gulf found the maritime competition framework irrelevant to the wars they were actually fighting. Again, what we find here, and everybody who has listened to me before knows that when it comes to professional military education, from boot camp to all officer training to the star-adorned Naval War College, Army War College, Air Force War College, the academies, all of it is fundamentally, deeply, and sincerely flawed at an institutional level, where the only way to fix this is to burn it all down and start all over again. This author's conclusion is that the officer who just wrote this, Commander Van den Nagel, wrote the most serious strategic concept argument in mainstream naval literature in years, if not decades, if not generations, is doing Turner's analytical work without Turner. He is asking what the Navy is for, disaggregating that question into strategic concept and force architecture, identifying the primary mission, the organizational gaps that prevent its execution, and arriving largely at the right answers, but absent some of the most critical questions, which is acquisition, which is the intellectual framework of the understanding that, in this case, all naval officers and naval intellectuals have as a result of their exposure to what is accepted in the community and what isn't accepted in the community. Had Van den Nagel worked through Turner, his piece would have confronted a question the Huntington framework allows him to avoid. What does each mission actually require, and where has the Navy failed to resource those requirements? Turner's framework forces that accounting. It does not permit strategic concept arguments to float free of operational content. In other words, it doesn't allow those operational and strategic framework questions to be unanchored to reality. It asks for each mission, what does credible execution look like? What does the institution need to provide it? And what happens when the institution treats it as residual rather than primary? This is the worst kind of institutional amnesia. This is the worst kind of martial malpractice. We have a Navy that is staffed by flag officers, that is staffed by senior executive service folks who have been there for decades, going on generations. It is staffed by people who have gone through this PME, that professional military education pipeline, who don't have a clue what U.S. and worldwide global naval surface warfare portends in this second quarter of the 21st century. It's not going to be ships firing at each other over the horizon and simply being in duels, a la the duels that were fought during World War II in the Pacific Theater of Operations for the most part. It is going to be missiles that are going to be lobbed from land forces, from littoral forces. There aren't going to be these blue water battles that these fantasists in the flag ranks of the U.S. Navy talk about. But Van den Nagel does something brilliant in this article, and I have appended the Substack post that alerted me to this. And by the way, my greatest compliments to the author in a succinct and very reasonable and analytically mature fashion. He really susses out what are some of the most important elements here. For all its, in my mind, subtle failings with Van den Nagel, he's one man who is quite literally standing athwart a naval institution that has lost its way in the biggest fashion possible. And he writes here the argument underneath the argument, and I couldn't agree with this more. Quote, strip away the Huntington scaffolding and the pan-oceanic doctrine branding and Van den Nagel's most specific, actionable, and genuinely novel contribution is 2 pages at the end of a long article. The Navy needs a dedicated robotic and autonomous system RAS warfare community with its own officer career path, its own commander, its own resource sponsor that is modeled on what naval aviation pioneers built and what Rickover built for nuclear power. That argument stands entirely on its own. It does not need Huntington. It needs the Rickover analogy, the career path problem, and the domain silo dysfunction. These silos of excellence that are everywhere when it comes to the Department of War. That RAS community gap is the anomaly in the current force design architecture that has no powerful advocate, no dedicated budget line, no career path that leads to flag rank, and no institutional home that is not already divided between aviation, surface, and submarine equities. That is the dragon. The rest of the piece is the map. End of quote. I couldn't have said it better, which is why I'm drawing directly from the article itself. And here's the author's conclusion, quote, the maritime strategy didn't disappear. Turner's article didn't disappear. They are sitting in the Naval Institute archive, available to anyone with a browser in 30 minutes. The problem is not institutional amnesia. Amnesia can be cured by remembering. The problem is institutional indifference, which is worse because the only cure is deciding that it matters. Someone in naval PME needs to decide that it matters. Someone in the wargaming community needs to build the consensus that Van den Nagel's article identifies but cannot by itself create. And the officer who wrote the best naval strategic concept argument in years deserves to know that he is not the first person to ask Turner's question, and that the last time someone answered it, they built a 600-ship Navy. End of quote. By the way, so hats off to that conclusion. I don't agree that we need to build a 600-ship Navy today. We can't possibly do that. Ours is nearing half of that by 26 and 27, the end of 2026 and 27. The only cruiser-class vessels in the U.S. Navy are going to be the Ticonderogas, have been the Ticonderogas, which will be retired by the end of this year, and 2027, the entirety of the fleet. They are entertaining an extension, I think, for 3 to 4 of those hulls, but we'll see what happens, because increasingly, because these ships are rather ancient, they're 1960s and 1970s mainframe technology that has been updated with various permutations over the decades, but they are getting long in the tooth. They are not aging well. And essentially, as I mentioned before, with the Arleigh Burke hull being commissioned in 1991, the last successful hull in the U.S. Navy. Because did I mention, by the way, what happened to the frigate project that they had contracted out to an Italian subcontractor? Well, that thing has been zeroed out. And then we have the absolutely silly notions of building a battleship. I think it's the BBGX or some other silly moniker that they're employing. We don't need battleships. As a matter of fact, we don't need any further surface ships. If you want to see just how toothless the U.S. Navy is in protecting sea lines of communication and all the rest of this, one just has to look at the Houthi campaign against commercial shipping from late 2023 through 2025, and it produced something that no defense analyst could have designed. Dozens of engagements against a wide range of commercial vessels using anti-ship ballistic missiles and every such thing, not to mention the fact that the U.S. Navy would send in carriers. Why they would send them into the Red Sea with the lack of sea room, I have no earthly idea. But nonetheless, you will note that those carriers tucked tail and ran on a number of occasions. Speaking of billions wasted, that BBGX, a nuclear-powered Trump-class battleship, suggested last year. The fiscal year 2027 defense authorization bill includes $1 billion in advanced procurement funding, split between $390 million for detailed design and $600 million for long lead items, including fabricated steel. The program's final assembly would take place at Newport News Shipbuilding in Dry Dock 12, the same dry dock where Ford-class aircraft carriers are built. By the way, the same dry dock, one of two shipbuilding sites in America capable of building nuclear-powered ships, much less ships of any type. But shipbuilding in America is dead. There is no design for the ship, not a preliminary design, not a concept design. Yet that design effort is $390 million. This is part of the problem. It is a webbed and meshed problem. It is a sickeningly sclerotic, arthritic, and Sovietized acquisition system that even the Soviets could not muck up as much as the U.S. has, where instead of a concept leads the acquisition dollars and the acquisition architecture and the acquisition framework is what determines, in the end, national strategy. This is madness. I've mentioned before that on December 8th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor the previous day and the destruction in the ensuing 3 weeks of almost the entire Far East fleet of U.S., Dutch, French, and British vessels, during the centrifugal strategy that the Japanese brilliantly employed from December 1941 to March 1942, what we saw is that all of a sudden, up until that point, that 24-hour interregnum between December 7th and December 8th, where all of a sudden, all of those forward thinkers, to include one Raymond Spruance, who had said that in the coming conflicts, one may consider naval aviation, to use a tired term, would trump the battleship as the capital ship that would win wars at sea. It turns out they were correct. All of the blood and treasure that had been put into shipbuilding with these kind of things. And all of a sudden they discover that as a result of the brilliant exploits of Kido Butai, which was the 4-carrier synchronized Japanese naval aviation effort to take on Pearl Harbor, that it turns out they were right and the battleship admirals were wrong. By the way, battleships as a concept are nothing new here. If you were to read Robert K. Massey's two brilliant books, Dreadnought and Castles of Steel, these things are doorstops, but well worth the read, where he details from the 1870s to the 1880s to the 1890s, when all of a sudden fighting sail was a distant memory for navies around the world, and oil and coal-fired ships allowed them to build these very large vessels, the dreadnought being the preamble, the precursor to the battleship, as it were, that once these ships are commissioned, no matter the size of the guns or the capability of the crews, they have a 10 to 15-year shelf life. America built not only battleships in the first part of the 20th century, so did the Japanese, so did the British, so did the rest. From 1941 to 42, we even developed fast battleships, which, by the way, were designed primarily as a weapon system that could keep up with carriers, because carriers had to be high-velocity ships by naval architecture standards in order to motor into the wind to launch their aircraft from the ships. By the way, launching aircraft in sortie generation that could reach 500, 600, 800, up to nearly 1,000 aloft in some of the later campaigns in 1944 and 1945, where over a 24-month period of time, from 1942 to 1944, the U.S. Navy had developed not only the ships, but the synchronization efforts that enabled them to do things that they couldn't dream of in 1942, as far as synchronized sortie generation to send so many aloft. What can a carrier send aloft now once it has done its combat air patrol, once its barrier combat air patrol, which is the outer perimeter force, protecting both the carrier and its armada of ships that provision it with other protections, since there are no guns, as it were. The 5-inch gun has gone the way of the dodo, unfortunately. If they were to send strike packages, especially with reduced wings that are 25% less than what they were in the 1990s, that if there are 60 to 70 aircraft on board, not all of those aircraft are strike aircraft, a strike package and sortie generation of approximately 4 to 6 hours would be less than 10 birds that would penetrate the cap and B-cap envelope to conduct offensive operations. Again, for so many reasons. And I dredge up all the data in my essay. I discuss it in those 2 podcast episodes I mentioned, so I won't beat that dead horse here concerning the aircraft carrier. But it is such an awful thing to keep in the marshal's stable, as it were, because it achieves nothing in this new era of naval surface warfare. The industrial base concerns compound the design concern. By the way, I'm not on the Christmas card list for the U.S. Aircraft Carrier Industrial Base Coalition I was taken off years ago. There is currently one supplier of naval nuclear reactors in the United States, BWX Technologies of Virginia. By the way, a quick note here. I seem to be bagging on the U.S. Navy all the time, but I did sing its praises about what it achieved during World War II in the Pacific Theater operations, which has no analog in the entire history of naval warfare for humanity. I wanted to talk about very briefly, thank you, Admiral Hyman Rickover. Thank you for delivering a nuclear power program in the U.S. Navy that has no peer in technology, in safety, in efficacy, in its ability to deliver nuclear power in a relatively and extraordinarily good track record despite losing several submarines and no nuclear carriers, of being able to pull off this nuclear miracle. By the way, Newport News is already running behind on every Ford-class carrier in the pipeline. The future USS Doris Miller faces a 2-year delay and 15-year construction timeline. The future USS Enterprise is 8 months late and stretching past 12 years. The House Armed Services Committee own amendment language states the concern directly accelerated BBGX procurement timelines will negatively impact the reactor supply chain, and the lack of physical shipbuilding capacity in Newport News could jeopardize Ford-class delivery. Those who don't know, China's shipbuilding industry outpaces the United States by a massive margin, with an overall production capacity estimated by the U.S. Navy to be over 200 times greater. Think of that. Burn that into your memory hole. 200 times greater. While the U.S. contributes less than 0.1% of global commercial tonnage, China controls over half of the world market. And they are fundamentally different in how they build and maintain ships. China builds over 1,000 commercial vessels a year, and the U.S. produces only a handful. Now, part of this, ironically enough, is because of the regulatory burdens and tax burdens and labor burdens, and I would say a generally negative viewpoint in the trades in the United States has contributed to this problem. Look at naval fleets. China, benefiting from its enormous commercial shipbuilding infrastructure, China now operates the largest naval fleet in the world. China's Navy is on pace to field roughly 435 military vessels by 2030, of which several will be blue water. But China has a very interesting strategy. If one were to look at it, you would see that not only does it not seek to be a military hyperpower, it seeks to be a regional hegemon, a regional and littoral superpower. And that does two things that global hyperpowers can't do. Number one, it allows them to focus on what those missions are and what they can do realistically. And number two, and most importantly, the protection of the respective homeland because of the concern about littoral operations allows them to be defensive in nature in addition to offensive, because America can't defend its coasts because it hasn't thought that that's important. Now, while the U.S. Navy remains the most technologically advanced and has significantly higher overall tonnage as a blue water Navy, as one that concerns itself with being able to deploy planet-wide to protect sea lanes, it currently operates around 220 warships. And it's facing a lot of challenges in keeping pace. And not only that, when one has a global hyperpower in which you haven't rationed your concern, as I think the America should reorient, which is reorient to the Western Hemisphere and leave the rest of the planet to their own devices and just concern ourselves with problems at home and in the near abroad periphery, to borrow a tired Russian phrase. But we have these holes that are quite literally drilling their naval architecture to destruction by mindlessly going thousands or tens of thousands of miles around the world for merely a military display. If it was about military efficacy, then how come in the Red Sea since 2023, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Iran, or whomever it may be, why is it that all these capital ships and U.S. naval war vessels have fled the area when they come under fire? It's because in blue water, they have a hard enough time. But in littoral and near the beach naval operations, they are subject to being under the gun, quite literally, of both land-borne, littoral-borne, and airborne missile assets, and UAVs, and FPVs, and UAS. Again, back to Van den Nagel's brilliant idea of the U.S. Navy starting to take seriously this unmanned threat. But will it happen? Who knows? So how do we fix this? And again, I posted this article. There's two of them from this gentleman in the show notes at the top. Please, I want to credit him as much as I can because his thoughts are so cogent and brilliant. And he asked the question under a modest proposal. Quote, there is a structural solution worth naming, even knowing that naming it will produce institutional resistance proportionate to how threatening it actually is. Suppose Congress asked the Navy a direct question. If you were designing a Rickover equivalent office for shipbuilding writ large, the same statutory independence, the same direct congressional reporting relationship, the same personal accountability architecture that naval reactors has maintained for 70 years, what would that look like? Who would lead it? Where would it sit? The Navy's answer would be revealing regardless of its content. If the answer is it should sit inside Nav C, the answer is wrong and the Navy knows it. Quote, a more honest answer, and the one worth forcing the Navy to confront, is that the office probably should not sit in the Department of Navy at all. Rickover's model worked in part because his dual-hatted role spanned the Navy and the Atomic Energy Commission, later the DOE. That cross-institutional mandate gave him authority that no purely naval billet could have sustained. By the way, Rickover would even go so far as to not wear naval uniforms and simply wear a suit. He could call on technical expertise, industrial oversight, and a regulatory authority that existed outside the uniform chain of command. End of quote. Admiral Hyman Rickover was the kind of cat that we need today. He was brilliant, he was acerbic, he was ruthless, and he was institutionally awake to what was before him with the U.S. Navy and decided to do an end run to make this happen and to make what is arguably the most formidable part of the Department of Defense and now the Department of War when one looks at its arsenal and armory of exquisite platforms. Nothing exceeds the efficacy and war-making return on investment of nuclear-powered submarines in this new age where all surface naval ships are subject to a very violent veto by masses and swarms of missiles and UASs. This gentleman suggests an Office of Naval Shipbuilding Accountability seated in the Department of Commerce would have structural logic the naval acquisition system cannot easily neutralize. Commerce already houses the Maritime Administration, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the economic and industrial base analysis functions that any serious shipbuilding oversight office would need. Now, you have heard me dog the Sovietized American military acquisition system time and time again. They can't produce effective warships. They can't produce effective aircraft. They can't produce effective, exquisite platforms. They can't do this on time. They can't do it under budget. They can certainly do it over budget, and they can certainly do it in a fashion that keeps legions of employees at the Congressional Budget Office busy. If it weren't for the fraud, the massive fraud in the welfare system in the United States, at the state level and the federal level, that is dominating headlines today, arguably and rightfully so, the acquisition madness at the Department of War should be priority one of one of the most expensive budget lines in the entire federal budget. I'm going to quote again the forcing function. Quote, here's what Rickover understood that the acquisition system is architecturally designed to prevent. External forcing functions are the only reliable corrective for institutional drift. America's Cup boats either go fast or they lose. Commercial ships either deliver on time or the customer walks. Rickover's nuclear plants either worked or he faced Congress, personally, directly, without a prepared statement designed to run out the clock. He testified frankly. He told Congress things the Navy didn't want Congress to hear. He named names. He understood the congressional oversight. Properly used was the one institutional mechanism strong enough to overcome the combined inertia of the uniformed services, the defense primes, and the program offices. The recent Constellation cancellation was the Navy's forcing function. It chose to treat it as a strategic pivot rather than a professional reckoning. This outlandishly stupid BBGX battleship is the next forcing function, arriving before the last one has been digested. Congress is already raising the alarm on the record and markup with specific numbers attached to specific concerns. Whether the alarm produces structural changes or becomes another paragraph in another GAO report is the open question. The Navy's shipbuilding crisis does not lack plans. It does not lack money, at least for now. It does not even lack good engineers. It lacks the one thing Rickover built and defended for 3 decades, a system in which the people responsible for decisions cannot escape the consequences of those actions. This bears repeating. A system in which the people responsible for decisions cannot escape the consequences of those decisions. As I mentioned before, we have had failed platform in the U.S. Navy after failed platform, whether it's the Zumwalt, whether it's the Ford and all the classes that are going to be built on this fundamentally and existentially bad design. All they're going to do is double and triple down on this. So in addition, we had the little crappy ship. We just had the frigate fiasco. All of this since 1991, which I call the marker on as the last successful hull with the Arleigh Burke that was commissioned to actually touch seawater, and the U.S. Navy could hold their head up high and say that here we have a ship that works, which they haven't been done for nearly half a century now. No one's fired. No flag officers fired. No one's held accountable. No senior executive service drone is held accountable. No drones in the acquisition process. You will remember the little incident that concerned submarine metallurgy that happened recently. I say recently, it was 240 productions of steel from 1985 to 2017 at a U.S. Navy steel supplier. Bradkin Inc. knowingly falsified the strength and toughness test results of high-quality steel destined for Navy submarine hulls. That culprit was Elaine Marie Thomas, the director of metallurgy at Bradkin's Tacoma, Washington foundry, faked test data for at least, as I mentioned, 240 productions of steel from 85 to 2017. This accounted for about half the steel the foundry made for the Navy. They discovered this in 2017, but initially tried to downplay the discrepancies. When confronted, Thomas admitted to faking the results, but claimed she did it out of frustration, believing that the Navy's requirement to test the steel's toughness at frigid 100 degrees Fahrenheit was a stupid standard. I would ask you to ask any acquaintance, colleague, friend, or family member who has served in the silent service, in the submarine service, just how valuable it is to have metallurgical integrity in the holes that you are encased in. I think all of them would say unequivocally that that is a rather important thing, and that I do wish it were over-engineered and not under-engineered. And here's the part you're going to love, and this is a microcosm of not only the Navy acquisition system, but the military acquisition system. The Justice Department hit Bradkin Inc. with a deferred prosecution agreement in 2020, forcing the company to pay $10.9 million. Elaine Thomas, what happened to her? she pleaded guilty to major fraud against the U.S. in late 2021. In February 2022, a federal judge sentenced her to 30 months in prison and a $50,000 fine. Now, I want to tell you how expensive this is. This is how expensive it is when this kind of thing, which is a microcosm, a drop in the bucket of what happens. If you find that the metallurgical standards had been sloppy for your submarine hulls, you cannot simply inspect one hull. You must inspect them all. They must all be inspected in dry dock with very expensive equipment over a very extensive amount of time for very serious reasons. This is a drop in the bucket. This is merely an indicator or warning of what's been happening at large. When this administration came in, and I heard that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, was going to go into the Pentagon, I thought, my God, the same organization that can't account for hundreds of billions of dollars, for trillions of dollars since the turn of the century, probably goes back even generations into the last century, of how they spend their money, what's on their books, what they've spent their money on. I mean, for them, $10 million is probably coins in the couch, but no one's held to task. And how much does DOGE fine at the Pentagon in discrepancies before they are dismissed? $80 million in wasteful Pentagon spending, primarily from canceled grants and diversity training programs. Later in 2025, Hegseth reported that this collaboration identified $6 billion in total budget cuts. However, official reviews found that these would be exaggerated. You will note it reads diversity programs and such, and in a future episode, I'm looking at you, P Squared. I am going to do an episode on the absolutely outrageously stupid activities of the defense equal opportunity machines and what they have done to the military. But $80 million in cuts in a budget that is nearly $1 trillion, I suspect because they were looking at diversity training and university climate grants and things like that. But they did not go into where the real meat of this issue is: acquisition fraud, acquisition misspending, acquisition mistakes, acquisition ineffectiveness and inefficacy. I would say, and of course this would simply be a swag, that there are literally hundreds of billions of dollars in acquisition mismanagement over a year's time, much less decades. So, my conclusion is this: naval surface warfare in this next quarter of the 21st century is going to have a reckoning, and navies around the world are going to discover that manned vessels and manned naval aviation and all of these things don't stand a prayer, they don't stand a chance, and they will not be effective in this missile age and this UAS age. It's time for the U.S. Navy to be held accountable for their martial mismanagement at an epic scale. Start firing people. Start holding people accountable. Start reducing flag ranks. Start making sure that people know that defense and not offense is the primary mission of the American military. This is Bill. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know that I may have come off as rather venomous, but it angers me to a certain extent to see what has been squandered, because not only are they squandering present tax dollars, but my children and grandchildren, as a result of deficit and debt spending on the part of the federal government, will be paying for these rusting, useless hulks, whether they decay pierside or become reefs, as I have postulated is the destiny of all U.S. aircraft carriers used in combat in this century will all become future fish apartments. So, thanks for listening. If you happen to be on your favorite podcast vendor, please leave a 4 or 5-star review. If you leave a narrative review, I will be forever in your debt. If you want to get in touch with me, it's cgpodcast@pm.me. That's cgpodcast@pm.me. Please take a look at my show notes for some of the sources that I employed here to include these 2 brilliant articles, essays, that I quoted at length. And take the time to spread the word to friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances who may have an interest in this kind of content. And I also wanted to do a shout out to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War. You will find it on your podcast vendor of choice and on YouTube. And listen to that. I have been listening now for months. I am absolutely enchanted by the work and serious effort and just professional delivery of this brilliant podcast hosted by Seth Paradon, Bill Tody, and John Parshall. John Parshall, I think, if I recall, was the one who was one of the authors of Shattered Sword, which is probably the authoritative account of the Battle of Midway in 1942. So with that, thank you very much. This is Bill, out.